Hello, this is John, and you are listening to The Purple Worm, the answer to the great cosmic question, why aren't there more podcasts where British guys moan and talk about RPGs? We've had a great response to our first few episodes. Thank you to everyone who's left us messages. We're going to try and get around to answering them all as soon as possible. And in fact, we're going to start this episode with some voicemails. But first of all, a lovely voicemail that we received from Che Webster. We're going to start the episode with that. So take it away, Che.
Greetings to the Fab Four. This is Che from Roleplay Rescue. Just been listening to your first episode of Purple Worm and want to say thanks, guys. It's kind of amazing to see a British supergroup form in the Anchorite community. So, yeah, awesome. Was interesting to listen to you. Thanks for reminding me about Kevin Crawford and all those wonderful random tables at the back of his books. And tempting me to buy into his latest Kickstarter. But all of that aside, the main point, hey guys, it's great to hear you. The Fab Four, game on.
That message you heard before the intro music was from Che Webster. Thanks very much, Che, for getting in touch. We really appreciate that. And now I'm going to hand you over to Dave, who is going to answer some more of the voicemails that we've received.
Hey guys, me again. I don't know if you're looking for suggestions of topics already, but following on from, there was a bit of a conversation on Discord between John, Andy. I joined in. There was a couple of others involved who I'm failing to recall at the moment. Apologies for that. But talking about making 5e more OSR, whether there was any kind of point to doing that, if there were rules that kind of successfully did that. Obviously, 5 Torches Deep and Into the Unknown. But I came across a few more. That version of Basic with a 5 instead of an S. There are a few attempts at making 5e more gritty, like Darker Dungeons or Mythgartha. There's also something called Dark Fantasy Basic. I just wonder what you thought about that, if you'd had any experience of those rules, and interested to hear.
Hi, Free Thrall. Great to hear from you. I think the summary of our brief discussion of this as a group of worms is that there's not much interest from the other worms in playing 5th edition in an OSR way. I think that was the general feeling. If I can summarise, if we've got all these OSR games out there, why would you try and play 5th ed in an OSR way? When you're playing 5th ed, that's what you're in for. I've got slightly more sensitivity to it, although I have to say that none of us really have spent any time looking at the various games that you mentioned. But certainly when I was making my first forays into the OSR, before I really encountered the games that have really captured my imagination, like the Black Hack, to an extent Into the Odds, definitely Maze Rats, I was fiddling about. It was 5th edition that I was fiddling about with. And thinking, how could I really strip this down? What's the most basic version of 5th edition I could come up with? And there are things there which are very conducive to an OSR spirit. Actually, once you cut out a lot of the feats and a lot of the class abilities, you're left with reasonably bounded proficiency bonuses. The advantage mechanic is what's been ported into a lot of these other games. But I think there are lots of things about 5th edition that, a lot of the newer OSR games aren't really using, skill bonuses, things like that. One route that I think is quite interesting is not so much, as I say, I don't know so much the games that you mentioned, which are trying to do 5th ed in a more OSR way, but certainly there are some modules out there which I think do a really good job of suggesting a more OSR flavour for your 5th ed game. One which I think I might have mentioned before, but I might even do an episode of my own podcast on, is The Tomb of Black Sand by Jacob Hurst, which is an OSR style 5th ed module, and I can recommend this for a whole bunch of different reasons. For a start, it is beautiful. It's got beautiful art in there. It is wonderfully laid out with a really kind of zine looking font and style, and it has gone for an OSR dungeon. Well, I would say it's an OSR dungeon crawl, but it's even an OSR dungeon crawl with a difference. The dungeon is there. It's got a good reason to be there. It's not simply there for the players to go in and kill everything and raid it. There's lots for them to discover, but then it does lots of things which I am very appreciative of. So it doesn't spend pages and pages and pages giving you reams and reams of world info. It's all scattered in there for the players to discover if they're interested and if they go to the right places, and instead of big chunks of descriptive text, it gives you lots of evocative random tables instead. And as we mentioned on one of our more recent episodes, I lose track of which ones we put out when and what we're going to attach the various responses to, but we do briefly touch on the fact that even 5th edition has been flavoured by some of the revival of some old school elements. So you find a nice few random tables in 5th edition, which you didn't so much find, I don't think, in 4th ed. So I hope that answers you. We may at some point get round to looking at some of those games that you list off, but I must say that in general the Worms were not massively enthusiastic about that.
Hey guys, Jason from Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I feel safe calling this in because you probably won't have time to air it. My vote for a weird game is also Japanese based. Well, it's written by, I don't think it's written by Japanese folks, but it's based on anime. So, you know all the schoolgirl anime where they're psychic and they're fighting demons and stuff? There's a game based on that. It's called Tokyo Brain Pop, although I own the earlier version called, I don't know, it's something like Panty Explosion. But anyway, in the game, you're playing schoolgirls, and you're all psychic, and you all have rivals, like rival schoolgirls, where, like, you're each, like, in love with the same teacher or whatever. But when you break out your psychic powers, your rival gets to narrate what happens and to embarrass you with it. It's actually looks like it'd be a great party game, or like for the end of the con kind of game. And when I say the end of the con game, I mean with your friends, not necessarily. I think you'd have to play with people you know. But it actually looks like a really fun game. I mean, I've read through it, and it's definitely playable. Tokyo Brain Pop. And like I said, I don't remember what maybe the old title was like Super Panty Explosion or something. There's no naughty art or anything in it. That was just the title, and then they renamed it, sensibly. But it's actually a really neat concept, and it really maps out to the anime and the manga that is prevalent in the culture. That my son reads a lot of that stuff, so unfortunately I kind of see it in the background, and it definitely maps to all that. So I think that meets what Dave wants, where the game models the media. So anyway, that's my vote for a weird game.
Hey Jason, thanks for the call in. This is funny. I picked these two. I said, I'll do those two from Jason before I listened to them, and I think maybe you'd have got a better deal from Pete. Well, what am I going to say about this? Yes, it does. I mean, you win the weird prize, definitely. It does sound like the games are interestingly, the mechanics track the source material, but I don't know. I shared some comedy with you recently, didn't I, Jason, that wasn't to your taste. And what am I going to say about this? Panty explosions, schoolgirls in love with their teachers. I don't know. The source material just isn't my cup of tea. So I'm going to pass on that one. I'll catch you soon, Jason. So I want to say thanks for the call-ins again to Spencer, Free Thrall from Keep Off the Borderlands, wonderful podcast there, and of course to Jason from Nerds RPG Variety Cast, also one of the Worms' favourite podcasts. Thank you for listening. Thanks for the call-ins, guys. Keep them coming.
Right, welcome back to the Purple Worm. I'm joined as ever by Dave, Pete and Colin, and today we're going to be talking about the dark side of advanced fighting fantasy, or as you might like to know it, the slightly newer versions of those. old, venerable, excellently laid out and produced tomes that we once knew, but way back in the sort of Albion mists of yore, back in the sort of 80s and 90s when they came out. But we're not going to be talking about the original versions, which we touched on in the previous episodes. No, we're going to be talking about the more modern version. I don't even know why I'm holding this up. I mean, it's a podcast, but I just can't help
It's
myself.
an audio podcast.
No, I mean, it's an audio podcast. Not one of those newfangled visual ones.
Scratch and sniff.
Yeah, I keep telling you, those videos will never catch on. But no, we're going to be talking about the newer versions by Arion Games. Dave, you're the man with all the sort of facts and figures. When was the Arion Games version first released?
It says here 2011.
2011. So yeah. So it's 8 years ago, give or take.
8 years ago, and he still ain't got over it.
I really haven't.
Now, just to like preface this for anyone out there, I'm sure you used to like. Certainly, if you listen to me, you're probably used to my jolly, good-natured banter. You know, never complain about layout or anything like that. Never have a bad word to say about a book. You could probably hear laughing in the background.
Formats, margins.
Yeah, never complain about margins or artwork or anything like that. But you're probably, I think it's fairly safe to say, even though obviously we've not yet recorded the rest of the episode, that you're probably going to get, maybe if you're perceptive, you'll maybe get the slight sense that we're not the world's biggest fans of these reissues. And this isn't to say that, you know, if out there, if you enjoy these reissues, you know, if you're enjoying them, crack on. That's absolutely fine. All we're going to present here is some of the reasons why we personally don't really think they measure up to the original versions of the book. So, guys, do any of you want to wade in? I can see Dave's champing at the bit.
Let him loose.
Yeah, that's it. Unleash the beast.
All right, so there's a few books out. They keep coming out. So there's been a sequel to Out of the Pit and a book of herbs has come out recently. I'm going to talk about the earliest books because I stopped buying them or looking at them. But the first book that was released was written by Graham Botley. He's obviously got the license for Advanced Fighting Fantasy, and so produced a book called Advanced Fighting Fantasy, the role-playing game. You can see that it's drawing largely on Dungeoneer. The cover art is the beautiful picture of the adventurers and the dragon from Dungeoneer. He's also reprinted or reissued Titan and Out of the Pit. I think it's actually a good idea. Titan and Out of the Pit are quite hard to get hold of, so having them in a form that you can get hold of is wonderful. What I would like him to have done is to have then just done the same thing with Dungeoneer and with Black Sand and Alanzia, but he's decided to rewrite the core rules. So you'll see,
Dave, sorry to interrupt, if I can just jump in there with a point about the cover art, because you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And I'm a massive fan of the cover art on the originals as well. Now, if you look at Dungeoneer, the original book, it's A5 or digest size, near as damn it, for Americans listening. The cover art pretty much takes up the entire front cover, and then there's like the title and a bit of text, etc. And obviously, like, direct your friends and exciting fighting fantasy adventures. Now, when it's been put onto the cover of the new book, all you actually get is like a thin strip of the artwork in the middle, and there's sort of like a faux sort of book cover deal going on where like most of it's covered over by these odd sort of beige rectangles that have the that have the titles in it. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, okay, yeah, I did art at university. I'm not going to say I'm the world's artiest person, but all I'm saying is, if you came to me and you were like, John, look, we're going to put some like new visual elements, nothing too fancy, you know, just a few like borders and whatever on the front covers of our new books, and you were like, what colour do you reckon we should go to, John? There is not even an alternate universe where I would leap to beige as my first choice.
I'm sure they'll say it's gold, but it's not.
It is most definitely brown. Sorry, that's my rant over.
No, it's pretty depressing, and so you've got those big bands, and that makes all of the books consistent because whatever cover art they've all got those big bands, so you can tell they're part of this new, the new series. So whereas with the original A4 size Titan and Out of the Pit, you had those beautiful complete A4 covers.
Big
again
old
with the
painting.
reissues, with the reissues, you've got those just for the sake of series coherence. I think you've got those great big bands across them. Actually, that's something it's worth picking up on the art now. He's obviously got access to a whole batch of the advanced fighting fantasy art, so there's pictures that you would recognise. But in the printed versions of the book, it's depressingly washed out. Actually, just flicking through it, I recognise these pictures and they make me pretty sad seeing them. And that's the same with the reproduction of the Titan and Out the Pit. The quality of those reissues is pretty. It's pretty.
It's the same if you look at the world map in the first book, as sort of seen in numerous original advanced fighting fantasy books. There's sort of this wishy, washed out sort of dark to light grey, depending on what page you're on. Which, given that some of the original sort of fighting fantasy artwork was fairly detailed black and white work, makes them quite difficult to look at, and in some of them, like, it's quite difficult to actually tell what they are, which is a crying shame given how good the artwork was.
Yeah, but as we've established before, I think these things might offend you more than me. I could forgive all of that if what I had in my hands was an affordable version of the game that I know and love. Yeah, but what he's taken it upon himself to do is to rewrite the game. Now, as we've mentioned before, there were some things you need to do to Dungeoneer to make it work. The first thing you've got to do is just lower the skill level. He's done that. So your starting skill is lower, which makes special skills work. That is pretty much all he needed to do. What he's actually done is invented a whole new system of talents, which adds in a whole bunch of subsystems. He's also rewritten the rules in a really kind of turgid, turgid style, like those old games, which whatever you want to say about them, you kind of think, well, if only they could have had a livelier writing style. Now, the thing about Dungeoneer was that, as we did talk about in the last episode, it had just wonderful features. It had that lovely sort of British humour going through it. It had that real introductory style. It had the conceit of directing your friends in fantasy films. This book reads like it was written 15 years before Dungeoneer. In addition to that, it's poorly edited and proofread, which depresses me. I think it's the height of arrogance, if you can't spell very well, not to get someone to look over your draft.
Has it got an editor credited? Is there a credited editor in there, or is it just a one-man endeavour?
Cover illustrator, it's got illustration copyrights. No, copyright Graham Botley, and then Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston are credited in there as well, but obviously they didn't have anything to do with this, I don't think. Let's have a look at the acknowledgements. There's Cubicle 7. Cubicle 7 actually put the thing out. But no, there's no credited editor.
Well, there you go.
Committed playtesters. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing. I think he needed to have been told that a lot of the changes he made don't add anything to the game. I think he needed to have had somebody give it a really tight proofread. I mean, it really, when I got hold of this, I thought, this is great. I thought, here's a nice shiny book that I can give to my kids, and they can have the same experience that I had when I picked open Dungeoneer. Because if I give my version of Dungeoneer to my kids, it would just disintegrate. But by the time I'd got to the end of it, I thought, no, there's no way I will give that to my kids.
I can't work out whether he's going for a sort of an old-fashioned feel with the layout, or he's just not spent the money getting a good designer and just doing it in Word, because it's...
Well, I mean, to give you an example of the layout, I mean, obviously people at home won't be able to see this, but I'm just showing like the very first page to my fellow hosts. This first page, it literally has 2 small paragraphs of writing and a few titles on it, and then easily 3/4 of the page is just entirely blank. And it's just like
it's more than that.
Yeah,
it's more than that.
It's just a paragraph floating in the middle of like a white space. Now, no one can have looked at that and gone, yeah, that's the layout for me.
So what he's done, I mean, I think I can understand some of the design choices, right? What he's done, if you look at the pages, they've got the bar style. So subheadings or chapter headings have got capitalized titles between two bars. He's done that to be consistent with the layout of Out of the Pit, I think. So the internal layout is reminiscent of the old A4 style Out of the Pit books. Yeah, it is. So he's done it to look like those. Although I've got my old Out of the Pit here as I'm flicking through it, and the art just kind of pops because it's all the same black and white art. But it's look, you can see it's like bold and it pops. So I'm showing my fellow worms.
And the A4 versions, just for anybody that don't know, if you can pick up the A4 versions, they were way crisper than even the original paperback small versions. The A4 versions, they were on better paper. The sharpness and the image quality was just the best. So if you can get Titan and Out of the Pit original A4, they're the best versions to my mind.
Yeah, so you can understand that he's done that. He wants because as I say, he's reissued Titan and Out of the Pit with new covers. Not great quality, but at least as written. And then I think the idea is that your new version of Dungeoneer, the Advanced Fighting Fantasy 2nd Edition, and your new version of Black Sand, it's horrifying what he's done to Black Sand, sit alongside that and are kind of internally consistent with it. But all he needed to have done to do that was to fix that skill. The Dungeoneer skill inflation meant that it was no longer compatible even without the pit. The monsters were no threat because they all had much lower skills than your weapon special skill. But to have added in, I mean, I think he's added all the various difficulty tables. He's sort of doubled in size. They didn't need doubling. They needed, if you're going to do anything, you could have just dropped them and just given a sort of 3-stage difficulty. Or a 6-stage, +2, +4, +6, -2, -4, -6. There you go. There's your difficulty modifiers for everything.
I think the other thing he could have done was go to a rollover system, and then that wouldn't have broken it. Then he could set target numbers as opposed to trying to fix the roll under, because you're sort of limiting yourself with roll under, aren't you? Certainly with the special skills. Because you've got roll high for the combat, so you could switch the other skills to a higher target number.
I don't know what I think about that, Pete. That sounds heretical.
I know it's but it's a fix.
I think one thing that is interesting, guys, because I have the Beyond the Pit sort of one, which was the second monster book, and actually the artwork in that looks a lot stronger in terms of the print quality. So I don't know whether that's a problem they had early on that they sorted out, whether it was a problem with the original artwork. But it certainly seems as you go through.
Well, I'll tell you something I noticed, just derailing the conversation a little bit and going back to the game books. When the original game books, when they brought out the Wizard ones, there was a drop in quality on the line art there. The originals were much sharper. And then the Wizard ones were a bit they were a little bit darker, but they got all a bit more like they were a copy, which clearly they were, like you photocopy a photocopy kind of thing, which was disappointing.
And also, I do have to say, I agree with Dave that the Black Sand book was fairly heartbreaking. But before we even get into that,
what's up with that?
What's going on with that cover image? It's just some dude holding a knife, whereas on the original Black Sand, you had some heroes facing off against 2 giant ogres or trolls or whatever. They weren't really dynamic.
I think that's the new City of Thieves. Isn't that the new City of Thieves artwork from Wizard?
It's just the world's most generic. It's just the world's most generic dude holding a knife.
I mean, I've got to ask. I mean, you could present this as kind of a labour of love, somebody who played Fighting Fantasy a lot, but was frustrated with a lot of the rules. But then when you read the books, you have to say, what is it you loved when you loved Fighting Fantasy? What is it? Because the humour's gone, the quirky kind of, the quirky monsters have gone. I mean, Dungeoneer, the the starter adventure in Dungeoneer, we talked about this last time briefly, it taught you to play. You went straight into that starter adventure. It taught you to play through the adventure. It had ogres throwing chicken bones at you, and then it had a fantastic. You've got none of that in here. I don't think there's a sample. I mean, I don't normally complain that there's no sample adventure. Actually, that's not a thing. But it gave you a feel for what Fighting Fantasy was and for what the adventures could be like. This seems to be Fighting Fantasy modified so that you can go back and play a generic dungeon crawl with it.
But plus, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, plus as well, the adventure, it was memorable. It sort of taught you what you needed to know, but it was also memorable. I mean, I've not read it. I've not read my copy of Dungeoneer for years, partly because it's a little bit fragile. But I can still remember that the villain of the adventure was called Sargon the Black all these years later.
Sargon the Dark, yes.
Sargon the Dark,
yeah.
But that sort of like stuck with me. And for saying that was just like a villain in like a couple of like cheeky sample adventures, that's pretty good going. And one of the things I like about the sort of Fighting Fantasy books in general is these big personalities, these big villains, you know, like the Riddling Reaver, Sargon, Zambar Bones, people like that. They stuck with me for a long time after I read the books. Whereas, as I said to you guys before we started recording this, I read through these newer versions when I got them, pretty much went, no, not for me, put them to one side. And literally nothing about them has stuck in my mind at all.
No, well, I was pretty heartbroken to have seen him. I should imagine, actually, that Out the Pit 2, or whatever it's called, the Out the Pit, is probably quite fun. Beyond the Pit, there's a whole bunch of new beasts. But he's frightened me away, or he's put me off with that first book. And there's just all sorts of other things. New rules. I mean, the poor editing stuff. New rules are introduced, which are then forgotten. It just doesn't hold together.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, though, with the writing. It's a very dry style, isn't it? It's just matter of fact, this is it, and no humour at all in it, and sort of no personality in the writing.
That's the bit.
And it makes it harder to read, I find, when it's like that.
Yeah, and it somehow is longer as well. Yeah. It's actually quite a hefty book.
I mean, the way I look at it is, if you were trying to resurrect or reprint, whatever you want to call it, some sort of fairly generic or unknown product, yeah, okay, you might have sort of got away with it. But like Fighting Fantasy, I mean, not specifically Advanced Fantasy, but Fighting Fantasy as a whole is so sort of well loved, particularly over here in the UK. And you know that pretty much like most of the people who are going to be buying this are people who've got some previous experience with Fighting Fantasy. And that's why they're buying it. I mean, Dave was talking about wanting copies for his kids. I don't have kids, but I was like, my old versions, they're a bit threadbare because I've had them for years and many house moves. I'd love to have some nice new versions that I could crack open, maybe run a few games and not worry about damaging through like wear and tear. But looking at these, I'd probably just, after this is finished, I'm going to put them straight back on the shelves and forget about them unless we do another podcast about it.
Well, passed me by. They've passed me by. I love the Fighting Fantasy, but I never picked these up. Why is that?
But you know what makes me sad? I see out on social media people saying, I'm excited, I'm playing Advanced Fighting Fantasy tonight, and selling it as like an old school experience. But just what makes me sad about that is that all you are playing is a sort of generic old school game with a sort of half fixed rule system. You're not really capturing anything of what it was like to experience Dungeoneer. John talks about seeing a picture of the two trolls or the troll guards. Do you know what I mean? And that was kind of what it was to me. Dungeoneer was about negotiating with those troll guards. And they had a particular kind of personality which I don't think you saw in other games. And it is Pete hit the nail on the head with personality. The personality is all gone from this book.
I'll give you an example of the style. If you look at a description of an orc in Dungeoneer, an orc it says orcs are the most common of all evil humanoids, and they infest all of Elancia. They are vicious, cowardly, cruel, and totally disgusting. Now compare that to Advanced Fighting Fantasy. Taller and heavier than goblins, but otherwise similar to their smaller cousins, orcs are just as evil. Commonly found in dungeons, wastelands, and wildernesses, orcs are brutal when they have strength of numbers, but can be very cowardly when isolated. It's just, yeah.
Wow, that's
spot on. Yeah, that's spot on.
Absolutely right. I mean, to read you guys another extract to sum up the differences in writing style.
Wow.
Dungeoneer starts off with like a preamble of like a bit of sort of icy fiction, I suppose you'd call it. But we'll skip over that, and this is how the original Dungeoneer starts. Have you ever wanted to star in your own fantasy movie, to become the hero of an epic sword and sorcery novel? The very best fantasy movies and books are wonderful excuses for letting the imagination run riot on an awesome scale, freeing it from the trappings of everyday life and letting it stalk through worlds full of excitement and danger. But think how much more fun it would actually be to be there, to be doing all the things your heroes do, to become your heroes. And that's like the first paragraph after the IC fiction. Whereas the first paragraph of the newer version says, Advanced Fighting Fantasy is a simple game to play that nevertheless has lots of options and specific rules. If you are new to this game in particular, or to role-playing games in general, this section is then for you, providing a very fast way to get started with the game. By reading through these few pages, you will be able to play a fighting fantasy adventure straight away.
Oh my goodness.
I got one more.
No, don't do it to me, Dave, man. Please, no.
Remember we said, I mean, that Dungeoneer had this beautiful starting adventure. Actually, I could admit now, because you guys clearly haven't looked in Dungeoneer recently, that one of the twists of it was that the prince who leads you to the tower at the start is actually in cahoots with the sorcerer. And there's like a plucky maiden that you have to rescue. And that was part of my inspiration for what happened in the tower in my Black Hat game.
Oh, right.
I did wonder, Dave, but I was like, no, I'm keeping it quiet.
No, it's all good. I can admit that now. But we talked about that last episode, that it was great. You had you had a great thing where the goblins attacked you, but there are all kinds of ways you could scare the goblins away because goblins are cowardly. But it was teaching you the rules as you went. And remember, it had that whole conceit of, cast of characters. This is how to run it for your players. If there are any problems, do this. Right, there is an introductory adventure in Advanced Fighting Fantasy, the role-playing game. I've just found it. The first thing is, it's called The Well, and it sends you down a wishing well, which I think is an homage to the quite duff adventure that you got in Steve Jackson's Fighting Fantasy, the introductory role-playing game, where you also go down a well. But the whole adventure is done in 3 sides of A4, yeah? And it is just classic, location by location, numbered locations, italicized text, a big old map, italicized text, and then a couple of paragraphs on what's happening in the room. And yeah, when you get to the big boss room, it says, this room is the living space and workroom of the necromancer who animated the zombies in room 5. He has returned from his travels and is looking to use the old well as a base of operations. The necromancer has several spells at his disposal, blah, blah, blah. Exactly what I mean. It reads like, the most turgid D&D module you've ever read. In fact, it reads a lot worse.
It's a textbook. It's just a textbook. Yeah.
The characters statted up as necromancer, whereas I can remember the bad guy, the big bad that you meet in that first adventure is called Zortan Throg. Yeah. And when you meet him, he has this amazing moment where he appears in the fire, his face is in the fire and it's flaming, and he cackles at you and laughs because he's not actually there, and you have to go into Black Sand in the second adventure and find him. And you remember that the princess is, really resents the idea of being rescued. And, it's just so memorable, so memorable. Grudthak the ogre throwing his chicken bones at you, and you compare it to this sort of location by location. This room has 5 zombies, they are statted thus. It's just it breaks my heart.
A squared plus B squared equals C squared, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's brutal.
When you think you can pick the original copies up for about Dungeoneer about £12 on eBay, and the new ones, the reprints or the repurposed ones are £25.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a no-brainer. Go and get one of the original ones.
Yeah, quickly before all of the anchorites buy them all up.
Yeah. When we say all the anchorites,
we're talking to you, Jason Connolly.
Yeah.
Or as I like to call him, Joe.
Yeah.
Did I play my call yet? I got a call from Goblin's henchman asking me whether he should fork out 80 quid for a Lanzia.
No, don't do it.
Don't do it. But all the others you can
I'm sure you could find it elsewhere.
Yeah, all the others you can get 11, 15 quid, can't you? But
Yeah.
Balanciers, it's silly money.
And I think.
What do you mean elsewhere, Colin? You're talking about a shonky copy?
No, not I, sir.
I think we spoke
Never
about
let
it
it
in
be
the.
said.
I think we spoke about Alanza in the last one where Dave was saying, it was most likely due to there being less sort of a lower print run of that because it was sort of on the way out when they did Alanza. And I suppose it's easy for me because I've got a copy to say, it's not worth paying for. But I seriously believe it is. Yeah, it is not. It's a nice book. I love my copy of it, but it is not worth paying like the silly money that people are asking for it.
Definitely not.
No, it's not. It's got a big good adventure in it, but it's got the longest of all the adventures. So quite a lot of it is adventure, which you might resent paying for anyway. But the big missed trick here is whereas Black Sand had all those beautiful city generation tables, this doesn't really. It's got a section that looks the same, which goes through Alansian environments, gives you a couple of rules for deserts and quicksand and stuff like that. But it doesn't really have any sort of generator. All it's got is a table. Okay, you've now left the plains. Where are you going next? And you can roll to see whether you're going into marsh or mountain or hills. But it's pretty sparse. And then there's some monster encounter tables, some monster lists. But it doesn't have any kind of wilderness generator to speak of. So it is a missed trick. It's got mass battles, which are quite fun. Actually, the mass battle system is quite interesting. It's reminiscent, or Ray Otis's mass battle system for his Lords of Mars game is actually sort of coincidentally reminiscent of this. It had quite a nice relative scaling system, so it didn't really matter whether you had 100 troops or 10 troops.
Yeah, it's quite abstract, isn't it?
And it had a few new spells, but the spells broke things because they were mass combat spells.
So what do you think of the Spike Pit Buyer's Guide, Dave? I would say pick up the Riddling Reaver, original, second-hand.
Yeah.
And Port Black Sand, or Black Sand, and maybe Dungeoneer.
Definitely. Yeah.
And then if you can get hold of a copy of Out of the Pit and Titan, that'd do you.
Yeah, in fact, I would go for Out the Pit and Titan first.
Yeah.
Then the Riddling Reaver. And then Dungeoneer and Black Sand together. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the rest, skip it or whatever.
Yeah. There we go. And don't be fooled, because although the Arian games, Out the Pit and Titan, if you can't get anything else, get those because they are reissues. The one called Black Sand is not. It's a rewrite. Don't get that. Hunt down the original Black Sand. Yeah.
Yeah. If ever there was a book that didn't need to be rewritten, it was Black Sand.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like 17. At the minute, last time I looked, that was about 17 quid on like Amazon.
Right. And the new version will cost you more than that. So.
Well, we come to the end of that. Do we want to talk about Troika at all? With what Daniel Sell's done with it?
I've got to confess, guys, I do not know a great deal about Troika. I've actually got a copy of it on order at the moment, but it's not arrived yet. But yeah, if you guys know a bit more about me, want to go into Troika and the possible relationship with Fighting Fantasy, etc., go for it, guys.
Yeah, kick us off, Pete. You did it on your show, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, basically, Daniel Sell has rewritten Fighting Fantasy, but has not referenced it at all. He's tried to fix the broken skills by reducing the points you get in these skills to start with. But the rest of it is Advanced Fighting Fantasy in name, if not mentioned. And he's even got the ups table as well, although he's changed it slightly. But the way Troika works is you've got a number of character options, and they're like pre-gens really. You roll a dice and you get one of those. And so his skills in the characters are sort of a flavour of the setting. So to reduce his sort of core background, when you get your characters, you'll get a skill that says pilot of an airship. And that's the first time an airship's mentioned. So it implies that there are airships in this setting. It's quite a clever way of doing it, but I know it's not for everyone. Some people prefer sort of, a hard and fast background for me, I think it's easy to write for, and there's lots of community content out there on the web where people have done cowboy settings and all sorts, because all you've got to do is just design a character, and there's not many rules for doing that, really.
I suppose the question I'd have about that, obviously not knowing a great deal about it at the moment, would be, since it's obviously taking a lot of inspiration from Advanced Fighting Fantasy, let's say I'm someone who hasn't got the original books, but I've heard about Advanced Fighting Fantasy. Maybe, as Dave was advising, I've picked up the new sort of Out of the Pit and Titan, but I'm like, I'm not so sure about the rest of them. If I had Out of the Pit and Titan and a copy of Troika, would I be able to use that to run effectively the original Advanced Fighting Fantasy?
Yeah, you could. So with one kind of caveat that he doesn't. Character creation doesn't have you building your character like it does in Advanced Fighting Fantasy. So in Advanced Fighting Fantasy, you get a number of points and you get a skill list, and you build your character from the skill list. Whereas in Troika, you've effectively got a D66 table of classes, and they are all pre-built. And that is lovely, but it creates a very specific kind of zany, flavorful world. That it was really zany, and I think you just need to either bring back the point by skills system, or even better, I think you could just go with, you wouldn't need D66, but if you just gave 6 flavorful classes that you pre-built, then you'd be good to go.
Call me cynical, but based on what everybody's saying so far, we've got Troika. Okay, yeah. Which is basically Advanced Fighting Fantasy cleaned up a little bit, and the serial numbers filed off for IP reasons, as previously discussed.
Yeah.
And then what I find interesting is then Pete is saying people are coming along and sort of saying they're doing Troika hacks. Right. But Troika ceases to exist when you take the setting out of it. So if you can't, my argument is you can't do Troika in the Wild West because it's no longer Troika. What we're actually doing is Advanced Fighting Fantasy in the Wild West, or Advanced Fighting Fantasy with the serial numbers filed off in space. Blah blah blah.
So he's
been hijacked. I feel like it's been hijacked.
He's got, I agree with you. He's got a couple of things which are distinctly his innovations. So there is a really neat encumbrance system where you basically, you have to roll to grab something out of your pack, and the further down it is in your pack, the harder it is to roll to grab it out in a hurry, which is very nifty.
I'm not convinced. I haven't seen that before though.
Maybe. And then he's got an initiative system which is really odd but kind of fun, where you have a number of tokens and you pull the tokens out the bag.
Yeah,
and you may or may not get your next turn.
Yeah, that's bolt action initiative, isn't it? For me,
yeah, that's wargaming.
Yes, that was.
Yeah.
So I suppose if you use those, you'd be using Troika. But my inclination would be to say
is actually in Space Hulk, more or less.
Right.
But what Daniel's done is he says in the text that you can sort of use it to hack away, just don't use his text. So that's what's given people the license to.
Yeah, but what he's really done is shown you that you don't need to use Troika. You could just hack Fighting Fantasy in exactly the way that he has. I mean, that's what it suggests to me. If no one's come after him, then if I was going to do it, I wouldn't do a Troika hack. No. I would. Yeah, it's exactly as Colin says. It would be a Fighting Fantasy in all but name.
It'd be Spike Pit the RPG, mate. Yeah, it'd be Spike Pit the RPG.
Yeah, it'd be Advanced Fighting Drive-Throughs.
Yeah, Advanced Fighting Drive-Throughs. Yeah, through the Spike Pit.
Out of the Spike Pit,
out of the Spike Pit.
I do think what you're saying though is true, and it's almost, for me, it almost feels like the most valuable thing about it. I mean, I'm sure it's a perfectly playable game. I know lots of people on the Discord server, Audio Dungeon, have sort of raved about it.
It's done.
I'm sure it's it's a playable game. I'm looking forward to getting my copy. But it sounds to me like almost more valuable than the fact that it's a nice game It's the fact that it shows you it's sort of like leading the way to other people want to hack some version of advanced fighting fantasy.
Yes.
Yeah.
As long as no one's going to come knocking at your door saying, "Oh, where's your Troika attribution to that?" You know what I mean?
Well, I'd love to test that out. I can't imagine he would have the front to do that because, it's interesting. And I've engaged with him about this. I mentioned before. He says Steve Jackson knows what I'm doing, but just Steve Jackson didn't write Dungeoneer.
No,
and Dungeoneer is the reference point. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we'll come to Mark Gascoigne at some future time. Hey, here's a nice link between Troika and something we will talk about, I imagine, in future episodes, Electric Bastion Lands. There is a big similarity there. I mean, what Troika does is build you a world through character creation, which, as I understand it, is exactly the principle of Electric Bastion Land. Apparently 200 pages of those 300 pages in the book are your failed careers.
Yeah. There we are.
Yeah.
We've got
the world, again, is built from those careers.
And there we have a link onto the next episode.
Yeah,
there you go.
And all I got to say there is first edition Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. That's all I got.
Yes, but which at least he does acknowledge. I've forgotten his name. Chris McDonald. Is it
Chris McDowell?
McDowell.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. So do we think we've sufficiently covered that? Do we want to wrap up this?
All those in favour say,
we'll just wait for.
I think I kept the lid on it quite well.
We'll just wait for Colin. We'll just wait for Colin to do the voicemails then.
Yeah, exactly. Wait for you guys to pull your socks up and answer some of them voicemails. Didn't catch me and Pete messing around. Doing ours straight on it. Anyway,
I got nothing to say.
Unusual for you.
Yeah.
That's why he's starting his new podcast. Okay, so thank you everyone who's listening out there. You've been listening to Colin, Pete, Dave, and myself, John, rambling on a little bit about the sort of reworked versions of Advanced Fighting Fantasy, and segueing into Troika a bit at the end there. All joking aside, hopefully by the time we release this, we'll have some answers for some of the voicemail messages that you've kindly left us, and we'll slot those in at the front of the episode. But until we speak to you again, from Colin, Pete, Dave, and myself, it's goodbye. Take care and watch out for those purple worms.
Bye.
Catch you later.
Bye.